The story I'm about to tell you is something that I can't stop thinking about. Have you ever discovered something so shocking that it completely altered the way you view the world? Like you've gone about your life in one way, then boom, something happens and suddenly nothing is the same anymore. And you start to question who you are and how you became this way. Well, I had no idea that one particular winter's night would turn into such a life-changing moment for me. I had been over at my friend Casey's watching movies, and I'd planned to stay over and just head back to my parents' place the next day. They're normally pretty chill about stuff like that, but for some reason, my dad called me around 8 p.m. and asked me to come home. He didn't want me driving in the dark, as there'd been some attacks in our area that were freaking everyone out. I was bummed about leaving, but come summertime, I'd be off to college, and I wouldn't need to tell anyone what time I'd be home at. Bring it on, I thought. By the time I said goodbye and gathered up my stuff, it was already getting dark. I decided to take the quick route home, as I could see my gas was dangerously low. I'm sure you can guess what happened next. I made it about 5 miles out of town when my car just slid to a halt, and of course it happened to be in the middle of nowhere. Casey's place was like 10 miles from my place, and here I was, stuck smack bang in the middle. There was no chance I was going to walk back to Casey's. I mean, I couldn't just abandon my car like that. I knew there was a gas station like 3 miles away near my house. Maybe I could run there and back. Who was I kidding? I'd just call my dad. He'd bring some gas, and we'd be good to go. I took my phone out of my bag and could not believe it. This seriously felt like one of those cliched horror movies. Girl runs out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Girl realizes it's getting dark. Girl discovers her phone battery is completely and utterly dead. How had my car and phone gone dead in the same moment? This was bad. Oh, this was really bad. There was nothing else for it. I'd need to sleep in my car, or face up to my fears of entering a dark forest alone at night and go find someone who might be able to help. I doubted anyone lived in this wasteland of an area, but still I had to go check. As I walked through the trees, I realized exactly where I was. This was where one of the attacks had happened. It'd been in the newspaper all week, and there were even some police warning tape on some of the trees. What was I doing here? I was literally walking into a death trap. Just my luck. The next moment, it started to snow. I'd completely forgotten there was a heavy snowfall coming. Great! At this rate, my car would be buried under snow before I even got back. This was turning out to be a nightmare of a night. And I couldn't even Instagram story it all because my frickin' phone was dead. Typical. I was getting ready to give up and succumb to the fact that I need to sleep in my car, when suddenly I spotted some kind of light in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was actually a fire. Oh my gosh. As if tonight couldn't get worse. Was I about to stumble upon a fire when my car burned down? No, this couldn't be happening to me. Then I realized it was just a little bonfire, but it was freakishly close to the hut next to it. I approached with caution and plucked up every morsel of courage in my body as I knocked on the door. My heart was thumping in my chest as I heard footsteps approach. Who even lived in a place like this? It was basically a glorified shack. My dad's garden shed was bigger than this. As the door opened, I felt like running away. Standing in the doorway was this huge guy. He just stared at me. I don't know who was more shocked, me or him. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. I just froze. His beard was so long, and it honestly looked and smelled like he hadn't had a shower in ever, actually. My hands started to go clammy, like when I get nervous, and all I could think about was how much my parents would kill me for walking into a trap like this. I might be 18, but I still know when I shouldn't be talking to strangers, and this was definitely one of those occasions. He invited me in, and I really didn't want to enter, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. What if he chased me if I ran away? So I sucked up my fear and followed him inside. You won't believe what was in there. Or rather, I should say, who was in there. Sitting around the fire, there were about 20 people, and they all looked really freaky, almost like they were in a trance or something. Firstly, I couldn't believe they had an actual fire in the middle of the room, and secondly, who were these people? I mean, they all looked kind of similar, so I guess they were related or something. Had I gate crashed a family gathering? Or were they calling in the ancestors or something? Seriously, it was so weird. The man who'd opened the door invited me to join them around the fire, and as I walked towards an empty spot in the corner, all eyes were on me. I felt so out of place. All I wanted was some gas. I turned to the man with the beard and stuttered, no, it's okay. I don't want to intrude. I just need some help with my car. You see, I ran out of gas and I really need to get home. And now my phone's dead and—" I stopped. The man was laughing. He didn't even care. He then said, "Don't worry, we'll help you. But first, come sit. Come get warm. You won't be going anywhere tonight." What did he mean I wouldn't be going anywhere tonight? I had to get home. I had no idea what the time was, but I knew my parents would be freaking out around about now. I went to check the time on my phone, and then remembered it was dead. Now what? Did this place not even have a clock? I stood up to leave, but the man with the beard stopped me and said I needed to eat first. That's when I noticed the huge pot on the fire. How had I missed it? It was like a big cauldron. He served me up a bowl of what looked like a mystery stew, and I said thanks. There was no way I was eating this. I'd probably die of food poisoning. But as everyone else started eating and slurping in acknowledgement of how delicious it was, I decided to try it. Otherwise, they'd just think I was some rude girl. And you know what? It wasn't half bad. In fact, it was pretty incredible. And they just, cooked this on an open fire? Wow. I usually just heated up my food in the microwave, other than s'mores, and the occasional BBQ. We literally never used fire to cook. Maybe they were onto something here. After eating, I politely said thank you and then excused myself, but they wouldn't let me leave. They said I could leave in the morning, only once the snow stopped, otherwise I'd get sick. They even made me up a little bed in the corner by the fire, so I wouldn't get cold. They were being weirdly kind to me. I asked them where the toilet was, and said sorry, I just really had to go. The guy with the beard showed me where it was, and I was so grateful when it was an actual toilet. I guess I'd been expecting a hole in the ground outside or something. I couldn't wait to tell the girls at school about this. If I ever left this place alive, that was. I came back from the toilet, and luckily the tea was nowhere to be seen. But now everyone was singing, and as I went back to join them, I realized this was actually kind of nice. I hadn't sung with people in years. I felt like I was back at summer camp. Honestly, these people were bonkers. Get a TV, people! Although as I thought this, I also had this other feeling wash over me. I felt cozy. If they killed me in the night, at least my last meal had been a good one. Finally, everyone left and headed to bed, and I lay there thinking, could this night get any stranger? I woke up in the night and had no idea where I was. I was shivering, and the fire had gone out. I reached out for my phone out of habit, and remembered it had died, but then I decided to check anyway. To my surprise, it had turned on. It was on 4%, but I figured I could call my parents at least. I had 27 missed calls. Oh no, it was 2 a.m. and they'd probably already called the police by now, especially with all these attacks that had been going on. My mom answered after one ring, and she sounded terrible. She demanded to know where I was and why hadn't I called her. I told her I was fine, and that I was staying at a random family's house by the forest. I was whispering as I said this, because the old man was asleep on the other side of the room. I didn't want to wake him. Of course, my mom started screaming and said they were coming over right now. I panicked. My parents were furious. I tried to sneak out as quietly as possible and decided I'd just wait for them back in my car, but they were already outside before I even made it to the forest. They were driving so fast I thought they'd drive right into the house. My mom jumped out and ran towards me, and my dad was just shouting, "Tilly, you get in this car right now. You are in deep trouble, my girl." And then it got worse. I heard police sirens. My mom was hysterical, saying what was this place, and that she thought I'd been kidnapped by these bad people, and that I knew not to come to this area. I just stared at her in disbelief. She was being so judgmental. She didn't even know these people. I wanted to tell her that, but now the cops were walking toward us, and the man with the beard was standing in the doorway, looking crestfallen. "I'm sorry," I whispered, hoping that he would hear me. I was suddenly so embarrassed. My parents had made such a scene, and now the cops would probably arrest all of these people, who were actually so kind. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that their life was pretty nice. I told the cops I was fine. My car had just run out of gas, and we could go home. There were no problems, but they still went to investigate. My parents told me to get in the car, and I did, but suddenly I stopped. "Wait," I said. Then I ran back towards the house and said to the man with the beard, "Thank you so much. I'm Tilly, by the way, and honestly, I'm so grateful. You guys are, well, you're pretty cool." I'm sorry if I acted a bit freaked out at first. I just didn't know what to expect." He reached out to my hand and shook it and said, "Please come back and visit us soon. You're a good singer, Tilly. Oh, I'm Kai, by the way." I wanted to shout at my parents about the way they acted back there, but I realized that I'd acted in exactly the same way at first. I judged them because they lived a little differently from me, and I was kind of ashamed of myself. I mean, I'd even considered that they might have been the attackers. The next day, we went back to get my car, and Kai and his brothers and sons helped us dig it out of the snow. When my dad saw how kind they were, he also came to the same realization. Even Ahanu smiled and waved at me, even though I hadn't shared his tea with him. I mean, I don't think I'm about to give up my phone anytime soon, or move to the forest, but I've become good friends with Kai and his family, and I go visit at least once a week now. They are such incredible people, and I was wrong to judge them. They might live simply, but they are way happier than a lot of people living in my town. And I love that they sit around the fire and tell stories and sing together. Sometimes we can surprise ourselves if we just open our minds a bit, don't you think?
We were getting higher and higher, the trees below us becoming distant specks of green. All of a sudden, I felt a bit dizzy, and that's when I realized the plane was shaking. I've been in planes before, so I know that it's normal to experience some turbulence, but this was different. We weren't in control at all. We were being carried by the wind, and I could tell from the look on my uncle's face that we were in serious trouble. My cousin sat next to me, and I tried to wipe the panic off my face, but I could feel him sliding towards me. We were going down. I knew it. I didn't believe in God, but in that moment, I prayed to every God out there, begging for them to save us. It felt like we were about to crash into the mountains in front of us. I closed my eyes tightly, and I could feel the plane slowing down as my uncle tried to turn it around. How long had he been a pilot for? I asked myself. But before I could even calculate it, he spoke up. "Everything's fine, kids. Just a slight hiccup with the wind on our tail, but we should be okay if I just slow the engine." That's when the plane started heading for the ground, as my uncle was mid-sentence, trying to calm both me and my cousin down. It's crazy. You'd think we'd be screaming, or at least a bit hysterical at the prospect of plummeting to our death. But in that moment, all I could do was shut my eyes and pray I didn't die. Or if I did die, that it was over with quickly. I didn't want to suffer. The last thing I remember was the trees getting closer and closer, and then darkness. You see, this had been my idea. I'd been nagging my uncle for a week straight to take me out in his latest little plane. Let me backtrack a bit. My parents are doctors, and unfortunately they were both on duty over the Christmas period. They had the bright idea of sending me to the mountains to stay with my aunt and uncle and cousins for the holiday. I was pretty excited because I loved to ski and snowboard, and of course there was always the chance that my uncle would take me out in his plane. And, well, here we are. Perhaps it wasn't such a bright idea after all. My uncle had been hesitant because of the wind, but I'd persisted until he gave in. I don't know how long I was out for, but when I woke up, I had to pinch myself to check if I was actually alive. The snow had saved us, I was sure of it. Miraculously, I could move. Nothing was broken. I looked over towards my uncle and cousin, and they weren't moving. That's when reality hit me. Was I the only survivor? I scrambled to take my seatbelt off, and that's when I felt a sharp pain shooting up my side. I must have broken something. I'd never felt pain like that before. I let out a cry of exasperation, and then I was sobbing. "James!" I shouted my cousin's name. "Uncle Jeff?" He didn't answer. I reached my arm out and shook my cousin. He woke up and cried in pain. His leg was caught under his chair, and it looked like it might be broken. Well, it definitely was. As soon as James oriented himself, a deep, guttural scream left his throat. I got such a fright, I just started crying, and then I realized why he was screaming. Uncle Jeff was bleeding. He must have bashed his head when we crashed. It was a lot of blood, and I didn't know what to do. I suddenly realized that if we didn't get out of this plane and get help immediately, he might not make it. And worse still, the plane could go up in flames at any moment. I managed to burst the door open, and there was a small, narrow space that we could crawl out of. James tried to get up from his seat and again let out a strangled yelp of pain. I had to help him. There was no way he was getting out of there alone. I am pretty petite, but when you have no other choice, strength just descends out of nowhere. I asked him to lean most of his weight on me to take the pressure off of his broken leg, and then I basically dragged him out of the plane. My uncle was more of a challenge. I was nervous to even touch him for fear that he wouldn't be alive. I didn't think I could bear it. But then I felt he had a slight pulse, and pushing all squeamishness from my brain, I undid his seatbelt and slid him out of his chair. He fell into a slump on the floor, and so then there was nothing else for it. I had to drag him out. As soon as he was out in the snow, the damage to his head became more visible. There was blood everywhere, staining the snow around him. The shock of actually getting this far and surviving meant that I was operating at full speed. I was in proper survival mode. We were still too close to the plane though. If it exploded, that'd be it. So I took both my uncle and James's hands and dragged them as far as I could away from the plane. I couldn't believe my eyes. Once I felt like we were far enough away, I sat down in the snow and just started sobbing. The pain in my side was getting worse, and I realized we had absolutely no way of contacting anyone. Our phones and the onboard radio were in the plane, and even if I could get to them, it's not like we'd have any signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Stranded in a mountain range, miles from home. This was the stuff of horror movies, and yet it was real. It was happening to us. I wanted to close my eyes and wake up from the nightmare, but the sound of James's voice brought me back down to earth. "Antonia, you need to make a radio call for help. You're the only one who can do it." I looked at him in disbelief. He wanted me to go back into the plane? No way! I mean, I could die. But then I looked at my uncle, and I realized I'd do anything to save him, even if it meant risking my own life. This was all my fault. I approached the plane with caution, and to be honest, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know the first thing about making a radio call, but I picked up what looked like a big phone thing and started speaking into it. It made a muffled sound, so I waited, but no one replied. It was useless. I felt so angry and threw the radio at the already smashed window. Why had I been so adamant that we fly in the plane today? I knew our phones were buried deep in the back of the plane in my bag, and I wasn't about to risk finding them. Plus, there was clearly no signal out here. James saw me walking back towards them, looking disheartened, and he knew it hadn't worked. I apologized, but he didn't reply. He just groaned in pain. What was I going to do? I thought about the journey we'd taken, and then it clicked. Just before we'd crashed, we'd flown over a small town. Surely it was nearby. Maybe I could make it there before it got dark and get help. Up until that point, I hadn't even realized how frozen I was. Luckily, I was still in my ski clothes, but at this rate, I'd have frostbite before the sunset. And yet, I was going to walk to that town if it was the last thing I ever did. I told James my plan, and he said it was at least 10 miles away and that I was crazy. I didn't care. The guilt I felt was too much to handle, and even though I was cold and in pain, we needed help. There were roughly 3 hours of daylight left, so if I walked quickly, I could make it. I said goodbye to James and gave my uncle a kiss. He was breathing softly, but still unconscious. I had to get going before it was too late. Have you ever tried to walk through deep snow? It's pretty much impossible. Every step I took, I felt myself getting stuck. But the race was on. My uncle needed to get to a hospital urgently. It felt like time was going so slowly, and after a while, I couldn't do it anymore. Everything around me looked exactly the same, and suddenly I didn't know which way I'd come from. Was the town behind me or in front? Collapsing into the snow, I admitted to myself I was well and truly lost. I was shivering, and I got it into my head that if I buried myself in the snow, I'd warm up. I was clearly delirious and exhausted, and soon I had drifted off to sleep. I awoke 10 minutes later to a loud whirring sound. What was it? And then I saw it, a helicopter. I couldn't believe my eyes. I started waving frantically, naively thinking they might see me. I struggled to stand up. My side was really in pain by that point. Luckily, I was wearing a bright yellow scarf. I took it off and started waving it above my head, but the helicopter kept going in the opposite direction. It's useless, I thought. I sat back down and buried my head in my hands. I could still hear the helicopter, so I looked back up. It was getting closer. Then I noticed it had turned around and was heading right towards me. I couldn't believe it. If it hadn't been for the helicopter, would I have even woken up? Turns out someone in the nearby town saw the plane go down and alerted the airport, who then identified it as my uncle's plane and sent a rescue helicopter to find us. Of course, they never expected to find anyone alive. As they told me this and lifted me into the helicopter, I was hysterically trying to explain where my uncle and cousin were. As we flew up, I was nervously crying. It felt too soon to be up in the air again. It didn't take us long to spot them. In fact, they were just on the other side of the trees. Then it dawned on me, I'd been walking in circles. They rushed my uncle and cousin to the nearby hospital, and even though my uncle was still unconscious, they managed to awaken him once he was in a hospital bed and had been given pain meds. He was very upset and confused, and was obviously suffering from some light brain damage. But the doctors assured us he would be okay, and James too. His leg was broken in 3 places, and they discovered I had 4 broken ribs. No wonder my side had been in so much pain. Even today, I can't bring myself to go back in a plane. My uncle still suffers from severe headaches and gets confused about what happened that day. He really thinks it was his fault, but I still feel guilty about it all. His pilot license was revoked, which devastated him. But we're alive and we live to tell the tale. And at the end of the day, that's all that really matters.